Pompey, he had many victories. He added all of Syria to the Roman Empire. He had a magnificent triumph. Another general named Sosius helped Herod the Great take Jerusalem back, and he got a triumph as well. But that's the end of it. From then on, the whole region is under Roman control with the Flavians. What do they take for the Roman triumph? They can't take any of the usual stuff because Judea has already been part of a Roman province for 130 years. So there's this big parade, which is supposed to be displaying all the treasures you brought from the foreign place you conquered. But in place of that, the Flavians have these gigantic tapestries. They've had artists create reconstruction of what they did over there. And it's all alive. It's all shows them, it shows the Roman legions facing phalanxes of enemy soldiers. That didn't happen. I mean, a wise man, if indeed one should call him a man. He was a doer of remarkable deeds. This man was Christos. The Christians who cite his writing through the first three generations, they know about Josephus and they use his works. They don't know about this passage, evidently. Origen, writing in the mid-3rd century, before 250, says, it's too bad Josephus didn't believe in Christ.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And I'm joined by Steve Mason, author of Josephus and the New Testament. And that's what we're going to talk about is Josephus. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thanks.
Let's get right into it. So Josephus is a historian who literally gives us a history of the entire world from Adam and Eve to the time of the Roman Empire. Like, this is there's nothing else like it. Like, there's no other historian that wrote a history that deep, I think.
Well, there were some that wrote kind of universal histories, from the beginning onward, but all of their works are they got big holes in them. We don't have them completely, or they're completely lost. But Josephus is by far the most interesting and relevant for anybody interested in, ancient Judaism, Christian origins, the Roman Empire, that kind of thing. Yeah.
So a lot of Josephus writes, he writes like about the Old Testament. He writes about ancient Israel.
Yeah.
And I'll start from the beginning, and we'll work our way towards like the Roman era. So my first question is, he's writing about this boat that he says everyone can see. It's on top of Mount Ararat.
Yeah.
What's the deal with this? Is this just a legend that he's heard from somewhere else and he's just adding it to his history? Or was there really some boat on top of a mountain somewhere?
Yeah, it's funny. It's a good question. Short answer is I don't know, but I imagine that he just heard it from people he considered reliable, that, he's a very well-connected guy. And so I guess rumors circulate as they do today, and you tend to trust people that you think they know what they're talking about. So I guess that's what it was. We don't even know where Ararat is exactly. So the chance that he went out and visited the thing, I think, is very small. But it serves an important purpose for him, because he mentions it not only in the first book of Antiquities, which is 20 volumes, but also in the last book, when he's talking about the conversion of some kind of Iraqi or northern Iraqi families in Adiabene to follow Judean law. He mentions it again. So it serves as a kind of bookend, a literary device, for one of many literary devices for his work. Anyhow, that's not what you asked about, but I think that's stuck in his mind. It's stuck in his mind, but I doubt very much he actually saw it. Yeah.
Right. So let's fast forward a little bit now. to the time of Alexander the Great. He writes this narrative that the Jews walk up to him with the book of Daniel and they
Yeah.
present it to him. And they're like, "Yeah, by the way, you're gonna conquer the world. Your empire is gonna be divided up into four, and then you're gonna die." And apparently, he was fine with that. So I don't know what you think about this particular passage, or if there's anything surrounding this that you know about that you wanna that would be interesting.
Well, I think, I mean, it's not completely fresh in my mind. I mainly work on the later periods, the Roman Empire, but that passage in Antiquities 11 comes after the description of Daniel in Antiquities 10,
Right.
where he describes the dreams and all of that. So I don't think he spells out there that Alexander is going to die, as far as I remember. But Alexander's had a dream, right? And the high priest, explains this to him. It's something like that, I think, isn't it? And
Yeah. Yeah.
so he's predicted in Scripture, is the main point, and he therefore, makes obeisance in Jerusalem, which again probably never happened,
Right.
because it just the whole feel of it is, the feel of a legend. And it's also difficult to reconcile with Alexander's movements,
Right.
known elsewhere. So yeah, so it probably didn't happen. But hey, that's how you do, ancient history. Um, and he's by no means the only one who does that kind of thing.
Yeah, another thing that I'm curious about is the Josephus problem, this math problem that we have where it comes from a narrative that he's about to be taken captive, I think, but it's right at the end of the war. He's losing. They're in a cave, and they all have to kill themselves. And he figures out, or I don't know if he figures it out or if it's by chance, but he ends up surviving.
Yeah, yeah.
What do you think about
Well,
this?
yeah, so there's a mathematical problem, exactly as you say, and the mathematical problem is, if you've got, was it 30 guys in the cave, something like that, where would you have to position yourself if the deal is that you draw straws, and if each person, well, forget about the straw drawing for a second. If the deal is that each person has to, like, you're not killing yourself, so
Oh
because that
yeah,
would
it's the
be
person next to
bad.
you.
You have to kill the person next to you. So the mathematical problem, it's just a big brain teaser, is, where would you have to stand, sort of calculate how the circle is going to get smaller if everybody kills the person next to them, right? But the problem is, it really has nothing to do with Josephus' narrative, because that's not what he says. He says that
Oh,
they
okay.
drew straw. He drew straws. They all drew straws, and he ended up with the last straw. So it was actually quite random. It wasn't something you could predict. But what gives rise to questions or suspicions of chicanery on his part, or double dealing, is that he says in his description, it would be terrible if the two people left at the end didn't follow through and kill themselves. So when he's left at the end, he convinces the other guy, let's not kill ourselves, uh, and we
Interesting.
survive.
So he might have lost. So you think he
Yeah,
might
he
have been
might
the
have lost.
loser?
Well, that's what
Yeah.
gives rise to the idea that he rigged it somehow. But
Right.
even with drawing straws, of course, it's not beyond the realm of possibility to rig it in a way.
Right.
Um, who gets the short straw kind of thing. Um,
That's
yeah,
fascinating.
yeah. Well,
Now,
this is not, just to clarify. It's not at the end of the war. This is actually near the beginning.
oh,
Um,
okay.
this is the end of the Galilean phase,
Right, yeah, the battles in the north, right, just before
before the
Jerusalem.
Romans come
Sure.
south. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's
Yeah.
actually within the first couple months of the campaign. Yeah,
Uh,
actually important, for this reason, that people tend to think of this as a connected war, right? And that's one of the stories that people remember. It stands out. But actually, the Galilean thing, that this ended. You're right that it ended the Galilean campaign. It was very, very short. The Flavians arrived in 67, in, maybe March, something like that, early April, and it's all done by the 1st of July, by the end of June. Then
so
they go up and celebrate for 3 weeks.
oh,
So
really?
yeah, I mean, this is really important for understanding. the nature of the war, that we talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, so then they go down because we look back at it as one giant 7-year war,
Yeah.
but like it's really the fall of Masada, the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of it's different areas of different regions, which
Yeah,
happens
and
to be
the fall of Masada and Machaerus and Herodian in 72, 73, 74. They're long after the end of the war. Actually, the war is
yeah,
ended when Jerusalem falls, and
70,
that's
right.
after that, that's when the Flavians who conquered it celebrate, and they hold a big triumphal procession in Rome. That's got nothing to do with Masada, Machaerus. They haven't happened yet. So the war is really over. It's this is, but you raise indirectly a really important question, which is the difference between Josephus's artistic narrative about what happened and what really happened on the ground. Like if you were there, what you would see and think was happening. So clearly, if Jerusalem's destroyed and the Flavians are celebrating the destruction of Jerusalem, the end of the war, peace, is here now. Vespasian dedicates the Temple of Peace. Um, that's all before. Well, the Temple of Peace is dedicated in 75, so that's a little bit later. But he starts building it already before any of that other stuff in Judea. So the war is really between 67 and 70. And most of that time, there's no fighting because Nero, the emperor, dies in the middle of 68. And so Vespasian, who was sent by Nero, can't do any more fighting. He has to figure out who the new emperor is before he can get a new mandate to continue. And Rome undergoes a civil war for a year and a half at that point. And Vespasian is the guy who emerges from the civil war as the emperor. So during that whole time, from middle of 68 to beginning of 70, almost 2 years, there's no fighting to speak of. Yeah.
That's gotta be a crazy time to, like, be a Roman because Nero is he's from the bloodline of Caesar. So this is like he dies, and all of a sudden you got, if I'm not mistaken, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Doesn't different parts of the Roman Empire claim different emperors right away, or did they all go to Galba?
There's no. It's not like in the third century and later where you have regional guys competing. I mean, it's true that the contenders for empire come from different regions, but there's only one emperor at a time in this period.
Right.
So when Galba it was the threat from Galba already initiated before him in the spring of 68 that ended Nero's life, right? So then Galba is recognized immediately as the emperor. That's it.
And then like
Game
2 months
over.
later,
Yeah. Well, then the problem is then you have other guys who think, right, that's no good. I don't want to serve under him. And Otto and Vitellius both immediately, especially Vitellius, is the
yeah.
guy who really doesn't want to serve under Galba. But Galba is the emperor. So it's not like, the two popes or something like that in the Middle Ages. There's only one emperor at a time. And the Senate will recognize, whoever is actually got all the power. So, yeah,
Yeah, and that the Suetonius's de depiction of what happens to Vitellius, how he gets dragged out in the middle of the streets, and
uh,
um,
yeah,
what a wow, that's wild. And then I guess Flavius's brother died that day too,
yeah.
Sabinus.
So, Flavius Sabinus, Vespasian's older brother, Sabinus was, yeah, I mean, killed by Vitellian forces in the most brutal way, and Vitellius especially. I mean, the as you say, the stories of his assassination are just, yeah, make your skin crawl. They did more than make his skin crawl. Yeah.
So do
I
you
mean,
do you
also Galba, it was not a pleasant thing to be, if you're thinking of how to leave this life, being a Roman emperor murdered is not the way to go. It's really, it's really nasty. Yeah,
yeah,
really bloody. Yeah,
what a crazy time.
dragged by hooks. Kind of thrown down into the river after you're already, stabbed like 100 times. Yeah,
I mean, it's like it became like a normal thing. Like Mark Antony, for example, his entire reign or his entire life, he's just triumphant here, wins here, does this here, becomes the second triumvirate, and then he ends in the same brutal manner where he has to kill himself. Like that to me is like anything can happen, anything goes at that time period.
Yeah,
Just a wild
yeah,
time of history. It really was.
yeah. Nothing is secure. Hey,
Julius Caesar.
Neil. You're very well informed, I must say. You read
I
a lot of
try.
history.
I'm an amateur. I read a lot, but I'm not like specially trained in anything. I just
Yeah,
like to
yeah.
read.
No,
Um,
no, it's
but
interesting. Yeah,
yeah, I love it. I love it. So back to Josephus.
yeah.
Is it true that he thinks that Vespasian is the Messiah, or is this a misunderstanding?
Well, I mean, we don't know what he thought because you know, we don't
Oh
have
yeah.
him to interview. But
Let me
so this is
pull
not.
him up real quick.
It's a significant question again because you have to distinguish between what he writes and what he's thinking. My own view. So what I say that to say that competent people may differ. But let me say this: that there's nothing clearly in his writings that indicates he thought that at all. And I think in my view, it's very, very clear that he didn't think anything remotely like that. His portrait of Vespasian is not what it's rumored to be. I mean, there's a rumor around. You'll see this occasionally in scholarly writings that he was besotted with the Flavians, that he was adulatory, just like Gaga praising the Flavians. Uh, I, I haven't yet found where that is. If you look at the footnotes where people say, look at this passage, that's not what the passage says at all. And I think this is just a preconception that people have. So, for example, with Vespasian, he portrays Vespasian as a tough guy, which everybody knew he was. He was an old soldier, but also as a serial liar and dissembler and cheat and basically nasty dude.
A true
Uh,
Roman emperor.
yeah, but not somebody that Josephus greatly admires. And B, he raises some serious questions about his actual courage when he's now over 60 years old, just when he's in Judea. And well, let me give you two examples. First of all, of the lying thing. when when Josephus surrenders at Yotapata in Galilee, right? The story is that he's hiding in the cave, as you said, with some other nobles of the town, and Vespasian wants to get him in his hands. So he sends emissaries around shouting to the caves, Josephus, Josephus, come out, please come out, we won't hurt you. And Josephus says, I knew this to be a lie. Of course, as soon as I poke my head up, they're gonna shoot me. It's just a very, very basic ruse to get me out, right?
Right.
You can see right through it. Then he sends a guy that Josephus happened to know somehow, a tribune named Nicanor, and he comes out, gives a big long speech, and says, Josephus, Vespasian is dying to see you because he thinks you're very brave. And he wants to know who this great general was who defended Yotapata. He wants to meet you. So you have nothing to fear. Roman honor is at stake. He will treat you well. Okay, that's what Josephus says happened. But then he says, I still didn't trust any of this. This was all a pack of lies. But I entrusted myself to God because God gave me a purpose for surrendering. So I did surrender, but not because I trusted Vespasian, because I trusted God. And here's the kicker: when it happens, he goes to the Roman camp and he's going to be killed. Vespasian's nowhere to be seen, and Josephus is about to be lynched in the Roman camp, except that Titus, who's Josephus' age, a little more or less, sees him and takes pity on him because he's a young guy. And he pleads with his father, Josephus says, Titus pleads with his father to spare Josephus from execution. So what if you just read, like, he doesn't say Vespasian's a rotten liar, right? I mean, that would be most unwise to say when Vespasian's the emperor and he's living in Rome. But just read between the lines. The guy's a liar. He
Yeah.
just flat out tried to trick him, and that lying repeats itself constantly in the rest of the narrative. Another quick story about Vespasian. Here's his character, according to Josephus. He went to see the Dead Sea, and he'd heard that things float in the Dead Sea, right? So he
Right.
wanted to test it. How did he test it? He got some of his men who did not know how to swim. I made sure they did not know how to swim. He tied their hands behind their backs and tossed them into the Dead Sea to see if they would float,
Did they?
right? And they floated. Thank
They did, yeah. Because I was gonna say
happily,
that that's the
happily for them, they floated.
yeah.
But what kind of character is this, right? Who gets his kicks from seeing? I mean, there are simpler
And
ways to
Domitian's the
find out.
bad one, right? Which one is the
Yeah.
bad one, you know?
Well, it's definitely not adulation, or he's not crazy about Vespasian, I think. And then in terms of his bravery, let me throw this out. So the Flavian story is, and we know this very well because it's in Suetonius, it's in Tacitus, it's in Cassius Dio, the other historians. We know that this is what they said, that their reign began in July, on 1st of July, 69, because that's when the governor of Egypt had his men take the oath of allegiance to Vespasian, months before Vespasian actually beat Vitellius. So, so they backdated their rise to power, saying this guy, Tiberius Julius Alexander in Egypt, already knew. He could see. He was very astute. And he independently supported Vespasian. And that was really the effective beginning of Vespasian's rise to power. Okay. So it's July, right? Now, Josephus's story completely undermines all of that. He says that's not what happened. What happened was it was Vespasian's own men in Judea, in Caesarea, who thought to themselves, "Why should we put up with Vitellius as emperor, and why should his men get all the glory for being the emperor's soldiers, when we have been out here in this godforsaken place in Judea, doing all the hard work for all these years? We're getting old under our helmets here, and our man Vespasian is a much better deal than that guy. That guy's a rotten drunk and a glutton, whereas Vespasian here, he's a good soldier. He's got a son who's proven himself. So the story is that they, for themselves, not because of Vespasian, they want him to be emperor. So they come to him and say, "Hail, emperor, imperator." And Vespasian says, "Oh, cool it, guys. I thought about it, but really, it's too dangerous. It's really not the kind of thing I'm into because like it's really hazardous. I prefer private life. Thank you very much. I'm honored, but and then they gather around with swords. They draw their swords and stick them at his throat and say, "Well, look, you will you will either live honorably and do what we're telling you to do, or we'll kill you. What do you want to do?" So this is Josephus's account of how Vespasian rises to power. Now, Vespasian also says, well, before that, he says, well, one of the reasons I don't want to do this is like I don't like the idea of winter travel. It's going to be winter travel to Rome. This is at the end of June, where it's like bang in the middle of the
Right in the
best
middle, yeah.
sailing season of the year, and he's worried about winter travel to Rome. Even if it were winter time, when he came to Judea, it was winter time. He traveled in the winter. Titus traveled across the Mediterranean in the winter to join him when they were coming out east. Right? So this is all nonsense, right? It's not A, it's not winter, and B, if you were tough, you would travel in winter anyway, if it
Right.
were important enough. But it's not winter. And C, when he does send his army, he doesn't lead it. So the soldiers hail him as imperator, which means, conquering general, but he doesn't go. he sends another guy, Mucianus, who's the governor of Syria, to lead the forces that will defeat Vitellius. What does Vespasian do during all this time? He heads to Alexandria, the
Mhm.
cafes and, uh, um,
He does the
uh,
healing thing there and all that.
yeah, he hangs out in
Yeah.
Alexandria for almost a year. A year. He does not even go to Rome until October, November
He
of
pulled a Caesar.
70.
He pulled
Sorry?
a he pulled a Caesar. That's what Julius Caesar did the same thing, didn't he?
Yeah, well, a little different situation, but yeah, he
Right,
hangs
yeah,
out
he went there, but he
and
was there for a while, if I'm not mistaken. He
yeah,
was, like,
yeah, yeah.
camped out there. Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea anyway, what I simply want to say that the idea that Josephus is some kind of Flavian, mouthpiece or a big fanboy of the Flavians is, I think, completely misguided. Your question was whether he considers Vespasian the Messiah.
Yeah.
No. Uh,
I I would have to agree with that because he doesn't never says it like that, or it's more like people twisting his words make him say that, and then you gotta remember this too. He's basically a slave to Vespasian. He lost to him in a war, and he's survived because of his allowing him to be there. So he can't say he's not going to say negative things in his writings. He's not going to be like, "I hate
but
Vespasian."
my
He's going to
point
say
is that
good things.
even yeah, my point is though that even the things he says are actually kind of negative
Right,
if you weigh them. They're not overtly negative, right?
right,
But if you weigh them against what the Flavians are saying about themselves, about being the great conquering heroes in Judea, that's not how they appear in Josephus. He
sure,
undermines their narrative at several points, not in an overt or hostile way, but for a knowledgeable audience who knows what the Flavians are saying about themselves. You read Josephus and think, wow. And he begins his war by saying, I'm writing because all these other people are flattering the Flavians
right.
and exalting them to the skies. And I want to correct the story and show how brave the Judeans were in facing them. So he positions his entire work against, in some way, the common picture in Rome.
Wow,
Yeah.
I never thought of it that way. That makes sense.
But
You know,
on the
sure,
Messiah thing, I do have to admit there is one passage in which it's not an admission, it's just a fact. There is one passage in which he says there's a scriptural reference that Judeans of his time took to mean that one of their own people would become a ruler of the world, somebody from the east. And actually, that passage referred to Vespasian. So those who see Josephus as a Flavian, worshiper, grab that passage and say, "There you go." He
right,
thought he thought Vespasian was the Messiah, but that's not. You don't need to go there. All he's saying is he's not praising Vespasian. He's criticizing the common people for having a tunnel vision and thinking that they were going to have some great, general ruler who would arise from Judea, a Judean, a Jew, and who would conquer the world when he says actually that's just a reference to Vespasian's, um, because he comes from the east, right? He becomes emperor from the east.
right.
Um,
So
but
is that about Cyrus and he's reapplying it to Vespasian, or is that something else?
well, it's not clear. It's not clear which passage he has in mind. I mean, one passage that's a possibility is in Numbers. A star will arise from Jacob,
Okay,
something like that. It could be. Many scholars have thought that's the passage because that had sort of messianic overtones in the first century,
the
and
only
so it
reason why
could. Yeah, go ahead.
the only reason why I bring up Cyrus is because he's the only person that's called Messiah in the Old Testament that's not an Israelite. So
Yeah,
that's why
but
I wonder, but
but Cyrus wouldn't quite work in Second Isaiah. In Isaiah, he is indeed called the Mashiach, right? He's the Messiah, the Anointed One um, of God. But that's because he allows, as you know, he allows the Judeans to go back for those passages about Cyrus in Isaiah to be construed as relating to a native-born Judean, because that's not what they say, right? It's
I
the
just thought of
opposite.
when a Roman general conquers, Germany or Africa, they get the title Africanus,
Yeah,
Germanicus. Did Vespasian get the title for Israel? No, there's no Judica or anything like that. Or
no, no, no,
okay, I just
no.
wondering. I have no
Yeah,
idea.
yeah, no, it's a
But
very
that's
good
interesting.
point.
Why is that region? How come they don't do that there? Well, that's weird, right?
Well, it's very tricky, and what you're asking about opens up a whole can of worms, but I'll
Yeah,
try to be very, very
I
quick
tend to
about
do
it.
that a lot.
Well, no, it's a really good
It's fun.
question. Um, Here's the thing, in a nutshell, that the Flavian claim to power on the basis of a victory in Judea was a big scam. It was a big lie. It was a big deceit, a sham, an untruth. Why? Because Judea had been part of Rome's empire for 130 years, ever since Pompey the Great uh, took it for Rome in 63 BCE, and Pompey already celebrated a triumph. So what I'm getting at is the
Wow.
deal is that you celebrate a triumph when you add territory to the Roman Imperium, right? The Roman Empire power. Uh, and you get to, as a symbol of that, in Rome, there's a symbolic kind of boundary around Rome called the Pomerium, which is, it's not a fence, it's not a wall, it's a series of stones, engraved stones, and these stones can be moved. When somebody expands the Roman Empire, the Senate notionally gives that person the right to expand the pomerium, this boundary in Rome, as a symbol of having expanded the Roman Empire. So back when Pompey, when Pompey, he had many victories. He added all of Syria to the Roman Empire. He had a magnificent triumph, right? And it's all recorded on stone. Then they lost the region for a little short time because of the Parthians. In 40 to 37 BC, the Parthians made inroads there, and they had to take it back again. And so another general named Sosius helped Herod the Great take Jerusalem back, and he got a triumph as well. But that's the end of it. From then on, the whole region is under Roman control. It's paying, I mean, Herod's a client or an allied king, but he's in Rome's. He's helping Rome out. He's in Rome's pocket, um, and his kingdom is at the discretion of Augustus. So when he dies, it's Augustus who decides what to do with his territory. So it's all completely part of the Roman Empire now, and they send Roman governors out, of course, as everybody knows.
Right.
Pontius Pilate and all these guys. So my point is, when the Flavians come back from Judea, they claim that they have conquered, that Titus has conquered Jerusalem for the first time. They claim that
Wow, I
nobody
didn't know
else
that.
has ever. They say nobody else has ever been able to take this site, and Titus did it with the advice and plans of his father. How do we know that? Because it was on an arch honoring Titus.
Titus, the Arch
So
Titus.
not yeah. So there are two. Not that
Oh, there's
there's
two
the
of them. Okay.
well, there's the famous one that you can still see today, that's been restored in the early 19th century. It was restored into a self-standing arch, and that's the famous one, right? But there was another Arch of Titus in the Circus Maximus, and a massive thing with a Latin inscription saying just this, honoring Titus for having destroyed Jerusalem and suppressed the Judean people, which nobody had ever been able to do before, right? So
Wow.
the Flavians are doing the whole triumph thing as if they had added a new territory to the Roman Empire, but it's a total scam. And Vespasian is even given permission to extend the pomerium, uh, as if he had added territory. So, and then they endlessly celebrate, as you know, with the coins. Judea capta, Judea is delivered to us, captured, taken, uh, and they just keep an endless stream of these coins in all denominations from all parts of the empire. They can't get over. Even then, the famous Arch of Titus, of course, after Titus has died, his greatest achievement is emblazoned on the south, panel there, the spoils of the temple in Jerusalem. Like, that's his claim to fame, is that he destroyed Jerusalem. But but Pompey, really took the place way back when for Rome.
You know what's funny about that is I think it's Tacitus or one of the maybe Suetonius. You might know this. It said when Pompey went in there was nothing in there. It was empty except for a laurel wreath. Um, I don't know if they're saying that. If whoever's writing this is, do you think that's true, or do you think because how all of a sudden a century later they're taking all this loot out? It's all this ancient. They got the menorah and everything. Like, how does that work? Like, did they hide it and bring it back? What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, it's a really interesting question. Josephus himself makes a big deal of the fact, but it's also in uh, where is it? I'd have to check. Yeah, but it's also in Cassius Dio, I think. But I could be wrong. That indeed Pompey. No, Diodorus Siculus. Yeah, also I think
Oh, right.
says that. But Josephus also makes a big deal of this, that Pompey went in and didn't disturb anything. He walked in and saw the Holy of Holies. But here's the interesting thing about that: that the Romans and the later Greeks had thought, they had believed, they'd claimed that the Judeans kept an ass in there, like
Oh yeah,
an
yeah.
animal,
I
right?
know this story.
And worshiped this thing. So the point is that when Pompey went in there, he was like, okay, where is it? It's not here. It's just empty. There's no nothing there. They're not worshiping any visible thing. So it was like quite a revelation. But the really fascinating thing here, that Neil, that you're asking about in relation to the Flavians, is Pompey saw all the masses of treasure, and he saw all the golden vessels, the lampstand, the golden table, all of
Okay,
that.
so it was all there. Okay,
And yeah, but he didn't touch it
interesting.
because he had tons of other stuff to take for his triumph, right? He had conquered the region, so you don't go raiding temples. I mean, in Roman thinking, that's a really criminal thing to do. Like, it's the most criminal thing you can, not only criminal but dangerous, because you really risk offending the gods.
Right.
You just don't do that. Temples are sacred places, and they are inviolable. They are places of sanctuary. So Pompey, he according to Josephus, he just admires the Judeans for going on with their temple service even while the city's under siege. And when he finally breaks through and captures it for Rome, he has a look around, and then says, okay, I'm not touching anything in the temple, but he's got all the other wealth from, the aristocrats he's conquered, all the wealth of the populace, and he takes it back to Rome along with all the other stuff from Syria, and he has a great celebration. But contrast that with the Flavians. What do they take for the Roman triumph? They can't take any of the usual stuff because Judea has already been part of a Roman province for 130 years. There's nothing for them to conquer. So they resort to actually displaying the temple implements in Rome. That's how desperate they are. And that's the only thing they bring from Judea. If you read Josephus' description of the triumph, everything else in it is made in Rome. Right? So there's this big parade, which is supposed to be displaying all the treasures you brought from the foreign place you conquered. But in place of that, the Flavians have these gigantic tapestries on which they display. They've had artists create their own reconstruction of what they did over there, and it's all a lie. It's all
Wow.
shows them. It shows the Roman legions facing phalanxes of enemy soldiers, and rivers running through all the flame, things like that. That didn't happen. I mean, that's not in Josephus' account at all. The Judeans had no phalanxes to face the Romans. So, so the entire display in the triumph is a sham. And the only thing they've actually got to display is the Golden Temple implements, which is really kind of a scandal, right? That this is it. Anyhow,
Wow, that's fascinating story right there. But it made me think of something. And I don't know if I'm not sure if Josephus even touches on this subject right here, but in the Talmud, there's a passage about a meeting between the high priest Yohanan and Vespasian. And so what made me think of this was you're talking about Israel was already a Roman colony. They're fighting against rebels. They're not fighting against the colony. They're fighting against rebels within their own province. So it made me think of the Talmud. This high priest Yohanan, he sneaks out in the middle of the night, pretends to be a dead man, and they carry him over to Vespasian. And the first thing he says to Vespasian is, "Hail, King! Hail, King!"
yeah,
And I
yeah.
almost wonder if does Vespasian talk about this at all, or is he just completely silent on this?
Josephus, you mean?
Yeah,
Yeah. Uh, no, he's completely silent about it. But yeah, so the story is, if you don't mind a gentle correction,
sure.
in the Talmud, it's yeah, so in Vot Rabbi Natan, it's Yochanan ben Zakkai, who is actually leader of the Pharisees, right? So he's not this. The reason I'm not trying to kind of catch you out. The reason it's important that he's not a high priest is
Okay.
that he is one of the founders of the movement of rabbis at
Oh,
Yavne. And this is how it's a kind of origin story of how he got out, and then the rabbinic movement was able to take shape, and the rabbinic movement takes over from in some degree from the Pharisees who had been in Jerusalem before. So this is Yochanan ben Zakkai, who is one of the founders of that movement. Um, but Josephus knows nothing about that, and I think that well, he says nothing about it. But I think again, most people would say this story has the air of a legend, of a story of origins, right? And it may be modeled in the part you just quoted about him calling Vespasian the king. It may well be modeled on the Josephus story, because when Josephus surrenders, he calls Vespasian Kaiser or Caesar long before he is emperor. So this is in mid 67, and
wow.
Vespasian will not rise to power until 69. Um, so anyhow,
That's interesting. So let's go to the book 18 in the Antiquities. I want to talk
okay,
about this particular book that everyone this is the big question. And it starts off he's talking about Pilate. Pilate's bringing in these statues, and feel free to correct me whatever I get wrong here. He's bringing in these statues, and the Jews don't like it, so they revolt. A lot of them get killed, and then he's like, "Okay, fine, I'll take away the statues." And then it gets into Jesus right after that. So it doesn't seem
yeah,
like it's placed there. It seems like it's naturally should be there because he's already talking about Pilate. So of course
yeah,
he's going to talk about something related to Pilate, who's
yeah.
Jesus. Um, the question is, what do you think on this passage? How much do you think of this is interpolated? Do you think it's all there? It's all was really there, or do you think some of it was there? What do you think about this?
Yeah. So the passage on Jesus. Yeah. Do I think? Yeah. This has been one of the most debated issues um, that people who don't work on Josephus regularly debate, and it's not gone away. I guess it's not going to go away.
Right.
This debate. So let me just tell you a quick funny anecdote. Well, I think it's funny. A scholar writing in 1863, right? So more than 150 years ago, wrote a book on this subject and said in the introduction, every conceivable position has been taken on this passage, but I'm going to make another, like he clearly thought this might be the last effort, if
And here we
people
are
believe.
200, 300 years
Yeah,
later, still talking. That's
yeah,
crazy. But yeah,
yeah. So that's why I think is not going to go away, this
right.
issue. But very, very simply, for the people who are watching this, I agree with you, Neil, that um, the introduction, that the setting of this passage in amongst Pilate's deeds is not problematic in any way. What's problematic are a couple of sentences in the passage. So he says, "Now about this time comes Jesus," and this is a very literal translation. So using the present tense that he uses, which he often uses in his writing. A wise man, if indeed one should call him a man. He was a doer of remarkable deeds, a teacher of persons who welcome the true things with pleasure, and he won over both many Judeans and also many of the Greek element. This man was Christos, or the Christ. On indictment by the principal men among us, and when he had been punished with the cross by Pilate, that is, crucified, a literal rendering of crucified, those who had loved him in the first place did not give up their love for him. He appeared to them after the third day, living again. These and countless other amazing things having spoken about him by the divine prophets, even to now still, or even until now still, the breed of the Christians, so in Greek, tophulon, the yeah, it's a very kind of genetic term, the breed of the Christians, named from this fellow, so Christiano, named from this Christos, uh, did not expire, or possibly translated, did not fail him. That could be a possible reading of it. So that's the passage. And what you see there are obviously a couple of things that sound a little squirrely for Josephus. One is to say he was Christ. That's an odd thing to say, not so much in terms of Josephus' belief, although that too, but also just in terms of the way he writes. Usually, if he's giving somebody's nickname, uh, he would say he was known as, or he was called, right? Something. He wouldn't just say he was um, this. And he uses a lot of nicknames for people, like the midwife's son, or the humpback, or whatever. He doesn't say he was the humpback. He just say he was known as the humpback, right? And then people know, okay, that's a nickname. He may not have been a humpback. He may have been some squirrely thing, like Cicero. Chickpea. He was known as Chickpea.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
so these, like the Roman world, is filled with nicknames, right? So that's a bit odd that he just calls him the Christ. He says he was the Christ. That's one thing. And the other obviously strange thing is he sounds rather Christian when he's saying the prophets predicted all these wonderful things, amazing things about him. So those two sentences have really attracted the skepticism of scholars for a long time, for hundreds of years, and saying what's going on here. And it's especially puzzling because Josephus shows no sign anywhere else in his writing of having any admiration for Jesus at all. In fact, quite the opposite. He's very big on Judean law, Moses law, and this is complete and wonderful and is good for all of life. He just never mentions Jesus. So there's no reason to think that he had any personal, you know, regard for Jesus. That's one thing. And second, the Christians who cite his writing through the first three generations, and they do, they know about Josephus and they use his works. They don't know about this passage, evidently saying he was the Christ, because, for example, Origen, writing in the mid third century, before 250, says, "Yeah, it's too bad Josephus didn't believe in Christ." So, if
Crazy.
they had known that he said that, then presumably they would have, you know, clocked it somehow.
He literally says he was the Christ. So
Yeah.
for Origen to say, "Too bad he didn't believe he was the Christ," that's a problem.
Yeah. And that's why, but it's not a new problem. That's why already back in 1863, this guy was saying, here's another go at this passage. Because what your viewers have to know is that Josephus wrote 30 volumes of stuff, right? And so I think for people who work in Roman Judea, this passage is not actually that important. It's not significant at all. It's two lines out of tens of
Right.
thousands of lines. It didn't affect Josephus's outlook on anything. It's just not that important. But of course, it's important for uh, people interested in Christian origins and whether there's external evidence for Christ, for Jesus outside the New Testament, things like that. That's where this passage comes up. Most it's in debates, about that kind of thing. But here's the skinny on it, is if I can put it that way. Where I think most scholars have come down, well, where they have come down, is that Josephus did write a passage on Jesus, and he wrote most of what's there. But these two lines about he was the Christ and the divine prophets said these things about him, his rising again,
On
living
the third
again
day.
on the third day. There's something hinky about those things, and the simplest explanation is that since it was Christian scribes who copied Josephus's works, they couldn't restrain themselves when it came to the passage on Jesus. And so he may have said something very close to what is written here, like he was believed to be, or he was known as Christ, right? And that would make perfect sense, no problem at all. He would just be saying that's the guy's nickname because Josephus is not into Messiah stuff. He never explains to his Roman audiences who Messiah is or anything like that. He just doesn't deal in this language. He uses the word Christos for like plastering because the word means, of course, smear, uh,
Right.
smeared, right, or anointed. But that's anointed is just a fancy word for smeared and mushed with something, blobbed with something. And he uses it elsewhere. He uses the word a couple of times for like plastering roofs and things like that. So if he says this guy was known as, the smeared guy, um, okay, so that's what he's known as. It's no weirder than any other nickname. And people say, okay, fair enough. That's what he's known as. Uh, so that wouldn't present any problem. And if he had said something like, and they believed that he had, you know, uh, lived again after the third day, that also would take care of the problem. So it seems most scholars think it's just something along that line that the copyist, early copyist just dropped out, the qualifiers, and so Josephus is left saying he was Christ, and yeah,
Have you ever heard or read this translation that's in circulation that somebody came up with, where it sort of makes it into a mocking
yeah,
phrase? Like, he said, "The
yeah,
so-called Christ," and these
yeah,
people believe that he did this, and, like, it's almost like I don't what do you think
yeah.
about that? Do you think that's plausible or no?
Yeah, it could be, but it's not necessary. I mean, the thing in history is it's like in science, you want to follow the most economical explanation of the evidence, right? So an explanation that has a lot of moving parts and hypotheses and possibilities, the more you add, the more unlikely it becomes.
Sure.
You see what I mean? Like if you say, well, to take an extreme example, what if Martians landed in the first century and they wrote the New Testament or something like that? Well, it's possible. I mean, I can't say it didn't happen, but it's not a necessary hypothesis. There's nothing that would explain most efficiently. So
Right.
when it comes to something like this, yes, this idea was already with Robert Eisler in 1929. Um, uh, yeah, and it's a very brilliant idea. But Eisler's book is like this incredibly ingenious web of propositions and hypotheses, one after another, after another, after another. It's like all of these conditions would have to be met for you
And
to
if
agree
one of
with.
them falls, the whole thing falls.
Well,
Yeah.
or not even that, but just simply in terms of probability. It's like, if I need to roll a six, just in terms of like ordinary probability, right? What's the probability of rolling a one on a single die? What's the probability?
Oh, 1 out of 6.
Yeah, but what's the probability of rolling two ones on two dice?
I don't know.
1 in 36,
Okay. I
right?
would not have
And
guessed
then
that.
Yeah, and then because you have to take you have to multiply, right? Because then it's like you could get a 1 6, a 1 5, a 1 4, a 1 3. But then because there are six options on each die that you have to match up, you have to multiply the possibilities. And if you add a third term, it becomes 1 in 6 times 6 times 6, right? So then you're quickly getting into highly implausible territory, right? The chances of doing that. It's different in history. Obviously, we're not talking about the frequency of rolling dice, but or getting certain outcomes. But the logic is the same, namely that the more conditions you place on your hypothesis, the more implausible it becomes because
Right.
you're making it a hostage to all of these conditions, right? So what I'm trying to say to you is to come back to your initial question. Yeah, it's entirely possible that almost anything's possible. Entirely possible that he wrote a very negative account of Jesus, but there are simpler explanations, right, of the same evidence. And here's the thing that a number of the phrases that he uses here in this passage are actually quite distinctive Greek phrases that other people don't use that he does use
Oh, wow.
elsewhere in his work. And that gives rise to the feeling that this is like something Josephus would write, but it has a couple of adjustments. And there's one more consideration that's very important, and that is that in later accounts of what Josephus said, for example, in the Christian writer Jerome, who in his Lives of Illustrious Men towards the end of the fourth century, he quotes Josephus on Jesus and says, he has him saying, this is what they believe, or that, this is what they thought. He was known as, he was thought to be, depends how you translate the Latin, Christ. He doesn't just say he was Christ, right? So Jerome seems to know a version of Josephus that doesn't just say he was Christ, but says he was believed to be Christ, something like that. And there's
Interesting.
also a later Arabic version, I think 10th century or something, brought to light by a guy named Shlomo Pinchas, who which says the same thing. And this is in Christian circles, so it's a Christian text, but it also says Josephus says he was known as Christ. And there's one more thing, which is I think even more decisive. You know about this, Neil, because I saw you on a previous podcast, I think, talking about it. In Antiquities 20, he reintroduces Jesus
Right.
when he's talking about the death of James, his brother. And instead of saying, so he's talking about a bunch of guys who were killed by this high priest. Ananus II. And instead of saying one of them was James or Jacob, who was Jesus' brother, he says one of them was the brother of the Jesus known as Christos, whose name was James. So his
which
whole
it lines up
way of
perfect.
yeah, his whole way of configuring that suggests that he's already referred to a Jesus who was known as Christ. Yeah.
And that's somebody who today would call it Jesus. Excuse me. They would still call him the Christ, even if they're not a Christian. That's his title. So it's
Yeah.
not that it's probably just it's probably this. I mean, this is after the gospel. This is after Paul's writings. He might have heard of it. I mean, who knows? You know.
Well, yeah, clearly his name was bandied around. This nickname or honorific title, Christos. Yeah, but it's unlikely that most people knew what it meant. Even Paul's followers, who are not Jews, right? When he writes to these Gentiles, he just calls him Jesus Christ, um, and you presume that they thought, okay, that's his name. That's how he
That's a
was
good point.
known. Yeah.
Because that book, and I'm not sure when they started numbering the Josephus or when they started dividing up his books, but it also has a passage about the temple of Isis in Rome and how the Jews got in trouble there. Is there any reason why he puts these together, or is this just he's just onto a new subject now?
In a friend of mine in Jerusalem wrote an article about this because Josephus introduces these things with Greek phrases, right? About that time. So, like for example, in this one, the Jesus passage, "katatuton ton chronon" in Greek. So it's like around that time, around this time, there's a guy named Jesus who's a wise man. And then about that time, this thing was happening in Rome as well. So it looks like, and my friend's article suggests that he's combining his different source material here, but in a very loose way, because the only other things he's recorded from Pilate's time, and Pilate may have been in office for like 18 years or 19 years in Judea. And the only other things he's told about him are that business of the emblems, the images on the standards, the military standards, which you referred to, the little statues,
Okay,
um, and Pilate's effort to build an aqueduct or repair or extend an aqueduct for Jerusalem, which should be a good thing, right? That's what everybody wants, an aqueduct. And Jerusalem had a couple of aqueducts, and Pilate enhanced the aqueduct for Jerusalem, which should be a good thing. But somehow it went awry. His plan for funding it went awry. So anyway, those two incidents, the standards on the military standards and the aqueduct, are both mentioned in Josephus's War. They're the only two things he mentions in War about Pilate. When he now comes to talk about Antiquities, he's got way more real estate to work with. It's a 20-volume work, right? So he can expand it greatly. And he adds this passage on Jesus, and then he adds the contemporary events in Rome. And I think that the simplest explanation is this is when they happened, right?
so
But
it's all
this is
chronological.
well, roughly, and this is important for dating Pilate, actually, for the question when Pilate's term began, because that incident in Rome we know it from other sources, was in 19 CE, 5 years into Tiberius's reign in the year 19.
Hmm.
People used to think that Pilate began his time only in 26. So if you look in most handbooks, I think even in Josephus in the New Testament in the first edition, you will see 26 to 36 given as Pilate's years. But this colleague in Jerusalem, Danny Schwartz, has argued that Pilate's term actually, and he's not the only one, has argued that Pilate's term actually began in 18 or so, and that would accommodate this stuff in Rome that's happening in 19, right, during the time of Pilate. But basically, to answer your question, I think that Josephus has clearly combined kind of a grab bag of things he's trying to keep coordinated chronologically in Antiquities 18. And so he also likes to change scene as
He
a
does that a
like
lot. He'll say,
yeah,
"Hold that
yeah,
thought for a second. Let's go to this po," like, he does
yeah.
that throughout the text a lot, so I
He,
yeah.
he does it a lot, but this is part of ancient writing. You know that the idea's variation of scene is like when we write today. You know, it's boring if you just keep
Right.
following the same train. Like your readers are just gonna, nod
It's
off.
like Game of
Uh,
Thrones. Game of Thrones
yeah,
have, like, 10
yeah,
different things going on at once. They're all not even connected at all, and then you have
yeah.
to wait, like, 7 seasons for them to all start to connect. But, yeah, that's what makes a good story.
Yeah, and many great films, right? They get set up in this scene, and then bang, you're off to like some of the films I enjoy most, and maybe many of your viewers would too, are these international things where so there's something going on in London. Well, look like James Bond films, right? There's something going on in London, and then you flash over to Taiwan or someplace, and it just gives you a feeling of excitement, right?
Yeah, it just works.
So
So,
he's doing the same thing with in a very primitive way because he doesn't have film to work with, but he's doing
right.
exactly the same thing. Here's what's going on in Judea, and there's this big fuss, and this guy was crucified, and wow, amazing. And he has his followers over. Oh, and look over in Rome, that this was going on with the Temple of Isis and these Judeans who were prosecuted as well for defrauding um, and things like that. So
He must have had an amazing education because he goes from being a military leader to this, like, writer who's, like, one of the best of all time. He's a
yeah,
smart
well,
guy.
he's a smart guy. I think there's no doubt about that. I think many people would question his military leadership and his
Sure.
and in the past they questioned his native writing ability. It would be hard to believe, maybe, but for much of the time of modern scholarship, people believe that he didn't write most of his stuff because he wouldn't have been capable of it. They thought uh, two things. First of all, he borrowed from a lot of source material that other people wrote, and he just kind of stitched it together and put his name on it. And then, second, he had the assistance of slaves, Greek literary people, who would actually be like ghostwriters for his work. And these were common views
That makes sense.
up until the 1980s. These were really common views. But, well, we know they're not correct anymore
Oh, wow.
because we now have tools, which we didn't have before, to study his language across the entire 30-volume corpus. And when you do that, you see that it's actually much more consistent.
Wow.
Even in his autobiography, there are formulas and phrases and concerns that he keeps using that cannot be from a source, cannot be from a ghostwriter.
That must have took years to write all that.
To write all his stuff, you
Yeah.
mean?
He writes a lot, and it's
Yeah,
well written. It's
yeah,
very, like, advanced. Like, it must have took because he okay, so how old was he when he gets captured? Like, in his 20s or 30s?
yeah. So he's born in 37, and he's 30 when he gets captured. We
Okay,
don't
so he has the
know.
rest of his life to do this.
Yeah,
Okay,
he spent half his life then in
makes
Rome.
sense
Yeah,
then.
yeah.
So, anything else you wanna say about Josephus that you think is interesting before we, close out?
Well, only that. I mean, one of the things I do is I run a commentary project. I just finished another volume on it, and it's an international team of people who are writing detailed word by word commentaries on everything in Josephus, all 30 volumes. And about half of it's been published with a publisher named Brill in the Netherlands. And the reason I mention it is not that people should run out and buy it; it's fairly expensive, but rather to be aware how interesting this author is. That every really, I can tell you honestly, every phrase. When I would sit down to work on this of a morning, I would just be, mind boggled that this guy is such a subtle, careful, intelligent, insightful writer. Either his word choice. when you start to then study, well, how often is this word used by other people, and is he alluding to tragedy or something like that, which he is in some cases. This guy is a really sophisticated writer. Yeah.
Wow. And I put a link in the description for your book, Josephus in the New Testament. Is there any other
Okay.
ones besides that? You got a couple books, right?
I guess I have 9 or 10 books. Depends how you
Nice.
count them. Yeah.
I'll just put the Amazon
Well,
link then.
yeah, the Amazon link is fine. In my signature on my email, you'll see a link to the Amazon authors. But yeah, I have a big book on the Judean War, like a historical investigation of the war, from 2016, Cambridge University Press, and a book on doing history, historical method, from 2016.
Nice.
So yeah, a bunch of books. Yeah. But
That's
thank
awesome.
you. Thank you
you
for
for
this,
coming on.
for
It's been
this
fun.
opportunity. Yeah,
Yeah.
I enjoyed it.
And like I always say, you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.